Alright, Mure Zimbabwe, welcome back pamzinda wenyu, mzinda wevanhu kubva kuvaneni wenyu Super Nexus. So, why is Chiwenga now the man everyone is watching? Zimbabwean politics has entered a dangerous and fascinating phase because there's one man whose name keeps appearing whenever people talk about the future of ZANU-PF, Constantino Chiwenga, the vice president, the former military commander, the man who stood beside Emerson Mnangagwa when the political order in Zimbabwe changed dramatically in 2017. And now, Zimbabwe, as Zimbabwe moves toward 2030, Chiwenga is once again becoming one of the most watched men in the country. But why? Why is everyone suddenly paying such close attention to him? Is it because he wants the presidency? Is it because Mnangagwa is beginning to prepare for life after his presidency? Or is something much bigger happening inside ZANU-PF? Let's get into it. Chiwenga is something most politicians don't. There are many ambitious politicians in Zimbabwe, but Chiwenga is different. He doesn't need to introduce himself to the political establishment. His history speaks for him. Before becoming vice president, Chiwenga was commander of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces. He was one of the most powerful figures in the country's security establishment, and his role in the events surrounding the removal of Robert Mugabe in 2017 permanently placed his name inside Zimbabwe's political history. And after Mnangagwa became president, Chiwenga became vice president. So for nearly a decade, these two men have occupied the very top of Zimbabwe's political system, and that creates an unavoidable question. What happens when the man above you eventually has to leave? That's where 2030 comes in. 2030, Zimbabwe changes everything. Mnangagwa has repeatedly insisted that he intends to leave office at the end of his constitutional term. That means the question of succession isn't some distant fantasy anymore. It is becoming a political calculation. And whenever people start discussing who could potentially inherit the ZANU-PF leadership, Chiwenga's name naturally comes up. Why? Because he already has the position. He is vice president. He has decades of experience inside the political and security establishment. He has relationships across ZANU-PF. And unlike someone suddenly appearing from nowhere, Chiwenga already sits at the top of the political hierarchy. That makes him impossible to ignore. But then came the constitutional changes. And this is where things get even more interesting. Zimbabwe's constitutional changes have altered the political environment heading toward 2030. The Senate has been expanded. The 10 new presidentially appointed senators have now entered parliament, and the country's future political system is becoming a major subject of debate. Suddenly, parliament matters even more. Political structures matter, party alliances matter, and the people positioned inside those structures matter. That is why Chiwenga is being watched because if the next phase of Zimbabwean politics is going to be decided through increasingly complex parliamentary and party mechanisms, the man who has spent years at the top of ZANU-PF cannot simply be ignored. And then Tabure. This is where the story becomes spicy, because while Chiwenga remains one of the most powerful figures in ZANU-PF, Udakwashe Tabure has just entered the Senate. Tabure is a businessman who has become increasingly prominent in Zimbabwe's political establishment. His appointment immediately triggered questions. Why him? Why now? And what role could a businessman with close links to the Mnangagwa administration eventually play in Zimbabwean politics? There is no official announcement saying Tabure is being prepared to replace Chiwenga. There is no confirmed succession plan naming him as Mnangagwa's successor, but political observers are watching. And that is important, because when a new political figure starts gaining formal positions while an existing power structure is already thinking about succession, people naturally start comparing the two. Chiwenga represents an established political power base. Tabure represents a newer form of political influence And the Zimbabweans are watching to see whether those worlds eventually collide. Chiwenga doesn't even have to say much. This is perhaps the most fascinating thing. Chiwenga doesn't need to constantly announce his ambitions. He doesn't need to campaign for the presidency every week. In politics, sometimes your position speaks for you. He is already vice president. He already has history. He already has influence. And he already sits inside the ruling party's highest political structure. That is why even a small statement from Chiwenga can generate enormous attention. And that may explain why the recent Chiwenga breaks silence story performed so strongly. Uh, People are interested in what Chiwenga says, but more importantly, they are interested in what his words might mean. What does Chiwenga want? This is the question nobody can answer with certainty. Does Chiwenga want to become president? Is he simply concentrating on his responsibilities as vice president? Is he waiting for ZANU-PF to make its decision? Does he have his own political strategy? We don't know. And that's precisely what makes the story interesting because political ambition is often not announced in advance. Sometimes it becomes visible through appointments, through alliances, through speeches, through people surrounding a politician, through provincial support, through who gets promoted, and through who suddenly becomes more visible. That's why Zimbabweans are watching Chiwenga. And what about the opposition? This is another reason Chiwenga matters. The opposition is also watching ZANU-PF. Any serious internal competition inside the ruling party could create opportunities for opposition forces. If ZANU-PF enters a period of intense succession politics, the opposition could potentially benefit from the distraction. But if ZANU-PF remains united behind a successor, the opposition faces a completely different challenge. So every movement around Chiwenga matters beyond ZANU-PF. It could affect the entire political landscape. The real question isn't whether Chiwenga is powerful. We already know that. The real question is, what is he going to do with that power? And that is why he is now the man everyone is watching. Because Zimbabwe is approaching political transition. Mnangagwa's presidency cannot continue forever. 2030 is getting closer. New political players are emerging. The Senate has been expanded. And ZANU-PF will eventually have to confront the question of succession. When that moment comes, Chiwenga won't be an outsider looking through the window. He will be standing inside the room. Final question, Zimbabwe. Uh, Keep your eyes on Constantino. Not because we can confidently say he will become the next president, not because we know what secret plans are being made behind closed doors, but because the man is already sitting in one of the most powerful positions in the country. And as 2030 approaches, every move becomes more interesting. Every speech, every appointment, every alliance, every silence, every appearance, and every time his name comes up in the succession debate. Meanwhile, new figures like Tagbire are entering formal politics, the opposition is watching, ZANU-PF is watching, and the ordinary Zimbabweans are watching. Because eventually, the question of who comes after Emerson Mnangagwa will have to be answered. And when that day comes, don't be surprised if the man who has been standing quietly beside Mnangagwa for years suddenly becomes the center of the entire political story. Constantino Chiwenga, Zimbabwe. Thank you for watching. Ndini wenyu super Nexus pano pamuzinda wevanhu. I'm out. Peace.